The great expanse of the American West. A land of many frontiers and once the arena of one of the greatest battles in scientific history. The story of the West is one of ambition, expansion, and bloodshed. Men and women lived and died on the frontier in search of gold, glory, and a new place to call home, often clashing with those who had already been living in these lands for thousands of years. But beneath the feet of those vying for control over this new world lies an ancient legacy millions of years older. Across the sea in the old world, scientists had been making remarkable discoveries of animals like none ever seen before. Massive reptiles that had apparently once roamed the earth from the land to the seas and the skies. The most famous among them coming to be known as the dinosaurs. And soon these discoveries would not be limited to the confines of Europe, for this newly christened field of paleontology would make its way to American soil. In the midst of this scientific gilded age would rise two inspiring scientists, both with the ambition and the will to make their mark on history. However, these two paleontologists, once trusted colleagues, would see their relentless ambition clash in one of the greatest rivalries of all time. This was the story of America's greatest dinosaur hunters. This was the Bone Wars. On October 29, 1831, a family near Lockport, New York, would welcome the newest member of the family, and the third of four siblings. Born Othniel Charles Marsh, he would herald from both the Marsh and Peabody families who immigrated to the United States in the 1630s, well before the country's foundation. His mother was one Mary Gaines Peabody, and his father, a man by the name of Caleb Marsh. Unfortunately, Othniel and the rest of his family would lose Mary just 3 years after she had had him. Caleb would soon remarry and move the family to Bradford, Massachusetts. The next decade for the Marsh family would see many struggles, mostly financial. When Marsh turned 12, his father would purchase a farm within Marsh's former hometown of Lockport. Othniel would end up traveling back and forth between Massachusetts and New York along with his father to help on the farm, taking care of the chores that were required of him. However, Othniel much preferred an exploratory lifestyle rather than the life of a farmer. Unfortunately, this resulted in a very contentious relationship between him and his father. His curiosity would lead him to explore the forest within the Marsh family property instead of doing the assigned chores. As with many his age, Marsh had a childhood hero of sorts, that being Ezekiel Jewett. Jewett was a former lieutenant under the command of General Winfield Mason Scott during the War of 1812. Later on, Jewett would reside in Bolivia, to which he would rank as colonel of the Bolivian army. However, he was also an amateur scientist, to which he would make it to New York and serve as curator of the State Museum of Albany in 1850. Marsh would actually end up meeting Jewett and have multiple encounters with him over his temporary stay in Lockport. Jewett would be the main influence that boosted Othniel's curiosity for natural history. Later on, Jewett would gain interest in possible fossils within the Erie Canal, to which he'd have his own private expedition, and following alongside him would be Othniel. This was an important moment in Marsh's life, as this would be his first fossil hunting expedition. In 1847, Othniel Marsh would attend Wilson Collegiate Institute, following which he would enroll in the Lockport Union School. In the midst of this stepping stone in academics, Marsh was rather indecisive as to what he wished to do in the future despite his early inspirations from Ezekiel Jewett. Regardless, Marsh was financially stable to do almost anything he wanted thanks to the help of his uncle and successful banker George Peabody, as well as George's sister, Judith Dodge Peabody. Through their financial assistance, Marsh expanded his academic career to a private preparatory college called Phillips Academy, otherwise known as Andover, in 1851. Marsh would turn out to be much older than his fellow classmates, to which they would often jokingly nickname him Daddy. At the start of his career at Phillips Academy, Marsh wasn't exactly the best of students, as his commitment to his studies were unremarkable. He much rather devoted time to leisure and games during his first year. However, during his second year, this attitude would mysteriously change. Marsh would become diligent and enthralled into his studies. His undivided attention to his schoolwork would eventually see him end up as a graduated valedictorian in the class of 1856. It is unclear as to what changed with Marsh between his freshman and sophomore years, though today it is suggested that the passing of Marsh's sister Mary, who died at the age of 23, may have had an effect on his mindset. When interviewed by a biographer while spending his afternoon at Drakew Heights, Marsh simply answered in the interview, "I changed my mind," with nothing more to add to the subject. During Marsh's summers out of school, he would prospect for minerals and possible fossils within Nova Scotia, and it would be through these personal getaways that Marsh would step forth into the scientific community as a published paleontologist. After he graduated from Phillips Academy, Marsh would be faced with a tough decision, that being whether to enter a program at either Yale College or Harvard University. Since many of his relatives had attended as students for Yale, he decided this would be where he would pursue his continued academics. However, there was one obstacle, that being money. Marsh needed more finances in order to attend Yale, to which he would turn towards his aunt and uncle for help. He would write up and mail in a letter to George asking for financial assistance. However, Aunt Judith was disapproving of the request due to 2 spelling errors residing within the letter. But eventually, both family members would agree to provide an allowance to help pay for Marsh's academic expenses at Yale. Following this, Marsh would move to New Haven in September. During this next step in Marsh's academic career, he was regarded as an excellent student, albeit not a heavily organized one. His financial management skills were in a poor state, leaving his Aunt Judith, who was in charge of monitoring George's account while he was away to Europe, scolding Marsh for his poor accounting habits, as well as his issue of spending large quantities of money on trivialities. Despite this worrisome spending habit, Marsh would indeed graduate Yale College, placing 8th in his class, but he wouldn't stop there. Using a scholarship he won for best examination in Greek, he would utilize the funds to enter into a graduate degree within the Yale Scientific School, though when he enrolled, the school would change its name to Yale's Sheffield Scientific School in 1861. Marsh did have a goal in mind while partaking in this program. He wished to be a professor in the sciences, and along with this, he would also discover his most ambitious subject of interest. That being vertebrate paleontology, to which he would go on to choose his previous trips to Nova Scotia as the subject of his master's thesis. Marsh would end up writing up 2 publications during his graduate program. His first publication was on the subject of gold, the very same precious mineral that had caused a dramatic rush out west in California. More specifically, his paper's main focus was about the various gold deposits alongside Nova Scotia, specifically in Province, and how it could be a place of great surveillance opportunity if a public geological survey was to be organized. His second publication, however, announced his first ever discovery of an extinct species. Supposedly found within the coal fields of Joggins, Nova Scotia, and later purchased by Marsh, were 2 vertebrae of what seemed to have been a type of reptile. Marsh in his publication would deduce that the vertebrae, while comparing them with other vertebrate species found from the coal formation, which also happened to be various early amphibians from the Carboniferous, carnivorous was actually from a marine reptile similar to that of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Marsh would go on to describe the animal after weighing the various similarities and differences between it and other related fossils as Eosaurus arcadianus. He would also classify it as an Annuliosaurian, which at the time was a grouping for both plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Today, there is speculation as to where the vertebrae were truly discovered, with most experts believing that the man who sold the vertebrae to Marsh actually obtained them from the Jurassic coast in England, where various specimens of the aforementioned ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were commonly located. These two papers from Marsh's graduate years would herald the beginning of Marsh's journey as a professional paleontologist. Marsh would even be offered a job as a professor at Yale, but to much surprise, he would turn the offer down. Instead, he had his eyes set overseas, to where paleontology was birthed, in Europe. Marsh would eventually tour around the Old World in 1863. However, it is unclear as to why he chose to take this path in the first place. Some do speculate, though, that this was Marsh's attempt to avoid being drafted in the Civil War. While in Europe, Marsh would continue his academic study once more by researching at the University of Berlin. This would be a place for Marsh to not only continuously improve his skills in vertebrate paleontology, but also to interact and work with fellow scholars of his day, such as Heinrich Ernst Bayrich, Wilhelm Peters, Henry Woodward, and even Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg. He would even continue working his connections at home in New Haven, eventually persuading his uncle once again to help fund a natural history museum at Yale, which would later become one of the oldest, most prolific university natural history museums in the world, that being the Yale Peabody Museum. Marsh had gained the most extravagant start to his career, one that allowed him to gain a foothold within the scientific community. He would even make acquaintances with many scholars of his field while staying in Europe during 1863, and pretty soon he would create friendships with many more within the same year. On July 28, 1840, husband and wife Alfred and Hannah Cope would welcome to the world their first child, Edward Drinker Cope. Cope's birth would eventually be followed by the birth of his two sisters. However, his mother Hannah would unfortunately pass away when he was only 3 years old. Despite this, Cope's mother's passing affected him rather little, as he hardly had any recollection of her. And when his father remarried to a woman by the name of Rebecca Biddle, she would assume the role of a maternal figure for Cope, and with this, Cope would grow up to have a great relationship with his stepmother as well as his stepbrother James Biddle. The family were members of the Religious Society of Friends, otherwise known as the Quakers, and would operate a shipping business in 1821 that was run by Cope's grandfather. The family's home in which Cope was born and raised was a large stone house named Fairfield. Today, the house's location is on the border of Pennsylvania. At 8 acres of land, the house was virtually surrounded by pristine gardens, a perfect place for an ambitious and curious young Edward Cope. Even at such a young age, Cope would show signs that his fascination was most notable in the area of natural history. His parents would be the educators for him and his siblings, mentoring the fundamental basics such as reading and writing, but they would also provide field trips for Edward, which included visitations to museums, gardens, and zoos. At the age of 7, Cope's family would travel to Boston for a sea trip, just a week after his birthday. During this trip, Cope would write a journal of his travels, and even a few drawings were made, some being illustrations of animals such as whales. Cope's natural artistic talent would aid him greatly in his new interest in animals, and with such a passion in learning more about Earth's fauna, it did not go unnoticed by his father. Alfred wished to provide his children with the same education he was fortunate enough to receive, so when Cope was 9 years of age, he would be sent to a day school in Philadelphia, and eventually, when he turned 12, he would be enrolled in the Friends Boarding School in Westtown near Chester, Pennsylvania. Alfred would thus have been paying close to $500 each year for tuition at the school, to which in today's currency would come up to almost $22,000. Despite how expensive the institution was, Cope nonetheless made something out of it. He would take classes on algebra, grammar, astronomy, and even Latin. However, he wasn't the best performing student in terms of conduct. Teachers would remark that it was either less than perfect or not quite satisfactory. Regardless of this, his performance in his studies was average at the time. Cope would often write letters to his family back at home. His letters suggest an expression of loneliness at school, being that this was the first time he had been away from home for such an extended period. Another piece of content in these letters would be that Cope often requested for more allowance from his parents. It has been purported by some biographers that this request was almost manipulative in nature. One biographer, Jane Davidson, stated in reference to the nature of Cope's letters that he was a bit of a spoiled brat. Cope also refrained from improving his penmanship, potentially leading to his illegible handwriting in the future. Between the years of 1854 and 1855, Cope would spend his summer breaks from school at a farm that his father would purchase for him. However, Alfred would not return Cope to school after the spring of 1856. Instead, Alfred wished for Cope to be a gentleman farmer. He considered this as a wholesome profession that would quite possibly provide Cope a more comfortable life and even improve Cope's health. Cope, however, resented the idea. In many of the future letters to his father, he would express a yearning for the scientific field and classified farming as dreadfully boring. There would also be a few letters where Cope chaffed at the thought of farm work, and he would even portray swings of temper. While working on the farms, Cope would indeed pursue further education on his own. In 1858, Cope would obtain a part-time job at the Academy of Natural Sciences. His job would be to reclassify and catalog specimens within the collections, and even publish his results in 1859. Cope would also take classes in German and French with the help of a former teacher from West Town, and while disapproving of Cope's scientific pursuit, Alfred would nonetheless pay for Cope's private studies. In regards to the farm that his father bought for him, Cope would no longer utilize it for himself, but rather rented the land out and partook of the revenue it would gain. He would use the new source of income to finance his educational and scientific endeavors even more. After many years of trying to steer Cope towards a farmer's life, Alfred would give in to Cope's wishes and finally help finance his tuition towards his son's enrollment to any chosen university. Cope's choice would be that of the University of Pennsylvania, to which he'd attend from 1861 to 1862. However, the exact dates as to which Cope attended this institution are unclear due to the fact that he had kept the admission slips for 1861 to 1862 his entire life. If his professors obtained the slips instead, then this would mean that Cope may have never attended the fall semester of 1861. Cope's first class within the university would be comparative anatomy, to which his mentor would be the famous paleontologist Joseph Leidy. At this time, Leidy had been trying to publish his recent paper on the large duck-billed dinosaur Hadrosaurus, but due to the outbreak of the Civil War, it would inevitably be delayed. Cope and Leidy would gain a great student-mentor relationship. It is through this great connection with Leidy that Cope would be able to enthrall himself within the sciences of the time. He would also be given another job at the Academy of Natural Sciences to recatalog the herpetological specimens. This immense amount of categorical skills would prove extremely helpful to Cope in many years to follow, and his tremendous research at the Academy would be noted by Leidy. In response, he would urge the Academy to make Cope an official member. Following this momentous promotion, Cope would also visit other institutions to help expand his researching skills, one of them being the Smithsonian Institution. It would be here that Cope would widen his range of connections by making the acquaintance of ichthyologist and ornithologist Spencer Baird. This would lead to Cope's first scientific publication, which focuses on the appearance of the primary divisions of the family known as Salamandridae, which consist of both true salamanders and newts. The paper also described two new species belonging to the family Hinobiidae. However, the paper doesn't provide the specific names to these two species in the results. Cope's membership with the Academy of Natural Sciences would also get his foot in the door for the American Philosophical Society, a scholarly organization founded in 1743. The society would become a major outlet for Cope, allowing him to publish or announce his works, and eventually it would house many of his early paleontological publications. As the Civil War continued to rage on throughout the 1860s, men would be drafted left and right in some of the bloodiest battles in American history, while Cope would avoid this fate, taking his next step to expand his new scientific career. He too would be one of the many young scholars to gain the fortune of traveling to Europe. Cope saw this as the perfect opportunity to visit the most esteemed institutions, especially the museums. In letters written to his father, Cope seemed to be interested in also helping out at various field hospitals when he returned home, but would eventually shift his aspirations towards assisting freed African Americans. It is suggested that geologists Ferdinand Hayden and Leidy, both of whom were also field surgeons in the midst of the war, might have influenced Cope to pursue this occupation somewhere along the lines of their contact. There are a number of speculated reasons as to why Cope traveled to Europe, one of which being purported in a biography by Henry Fairfield Osborne was that Cope may have also fled to Europe to avoid the draft in the Civil War. This was attributed to one of Cope's letters to his father in 1864, stating, "I shall get home in time to catch and be caught by the new draft. I shall not be sorry for this, as I know certain persons who would be mean enough to say that I have gone to Europe to avoid the war." Cope would pragmatically approach the war by waiting it out in Europe. Before the writing of the letter, however, Cope's time in Europe did turn rocky, as he would enter into a love affair that would soon fall apart. It is virtually unknown as to who called this relationship off, but it resulted in a heartbroken Edward Cope. It is theorized that Cope may have even suffered spells of mild depression during his extended stay. Evidence to this would be brought by biographer Jane Davidson, showing that other letters Cope wrote to his father are often of him complaining about sheer boredom while staying, and also expressing self-reflection between him and his colleagues. In 1863, despite this emotional wave enveloping Cope, he pressed onwards with his tour of Europe, traversing through France, Great Britain, Ireland, Italy, Austria, Germany, and eventually arriving in Berlin. In the midst of his travels, Cope made an abundance of connections with many highly esteemed scientists and scholars. In the winter of 1863, Cope would prepare himself to visit the University of Berlin, the famed public research palace right in the center of Mitte. His visit to the institution was one of the many museums and schools that he wished to visit to expand his research, but most certainly another potential place to gain that crucial set of connections with fellow scholars to help boost his success in paleontology and biology. It is here that Cope would meet many esteemed scientists, but perhaps most importantly, a 32-year-old bearded man, one with just as keen an interest in the sciences as himself. He too would turn out to be a fellow researcher in biology, geology, and specifically paleontology. Here in the University of Berlin, Edward Drinker Cope would first meet Othniel Charles Marsh. At first, it would be occasional run-ins as the two continued their research whenever visiting the university. However, it would morph into an amicable friendship. Both scholars would share discussions about their fossil findings, as well as tour the city together, visiting the various landmarks within the area. Cope and Marsh would also traverse back and forth to the university, attending the various scientific presentations and lectures, mostly from German paleontologist Christian Erich Hermann von Meyer. This newly found friendship would allow each scientist to trust the other to the point where they would share specimens within their own collections and name new species after one another, like the amphibian Tyonius marshii and the mosasaur Mosasaurus copianus. Following his time in Berlin in 1864, Cope would start his return to Philadelphia. But before he would leave Berlin, Marsh would ensure that his connection with Cope remained strong, and thus the two paleontologists would exchange their addresses so they could further collaborate, as Marsh would still find things to preoccupy himself with before he would depart from Europe, one being a fishing expedition in Ireland for salmon. Both Cope and Marsh were often seen by their peers as solitary in nature, but their time in Berlin would change their lives forever. From once almost lonely students, now friends within the sciences. The two separated paleontologists would be eager to reach out to each other once again when both returned to America to unite their minds and collaborate on uncovering the forgotten prehistoric world. However, as is often the case, history had other plans for these two individuals, and this budding friendship would not last long. as the two men would see themselves devolve into a fierce rivalry, the likes of which the paleontological world had never seen before or since.